Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. The billionaire philanthropist Jeffrey Epstein ran a global pedophile ring, supplied children to presidents, prime ministers, and princes, secretly filmed these powerful men in compromising positions on his private island, and blackmailed them on behalf of intelligence agencies. That is the narrative that you've been sold, and almost every part of it is false. That may be a shocking claim, but it's true. Once you sift out the fabrications and the rumors and focus only on the documented facts, including everything that's been released recently, the Epstein story morphs from a Hollywood tale of sex trafficking to a mundane tale of one man's private sleaziness. That is the argument of my guest today, and trust me, he has the receipts. Michael Tracey is a journalist who has written for outlets like The Nation and Vice. He was an early skeptic of the Trump-Russia collusion story, and he turned out to be right on the money about that. And I think a similar vindication is awaiting him on the Epstein myth. In this episode, Michael and I talk about why it's important to fight moral panics while they're happening. We talk about how the Epstein myth got started. We talk about Virginia Roberts Giuffre, her role in creating the Epstein myth, and her credibility as a witness. We talk about what Epstein was actually convicted of in 2008 and how that differs from what people imagine he was convicted of. We talk about what a typical person who met Epstein at a conference in, say, the 2010s could have been reasonably expected to know about him at the time. We discuss the ethics of associating with people who have criminal records. We examine the supposed evidence that Epstein blackmailed powerful people on behalf of intelligence agencies. We talk about whether Epstein killed himself. We talk about what Michael calls the shambolic trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, and much more. So without further ado, Michael Tracey. Michael Tracey, thanks so much for coming on my show.
Thanks for inviting me.
So I've been paying close attention to your coverage of the Jeffrey Epstein issue for the past few months, and you are one of the lone few voices out there that is keeping track of this story from a purely fact-based perspective, namely, what is in the public record that we can verify was true about this guy, Jeffrey Epstein, as opposed to the narrative that has become just enormously popular, totally devoid from fact. And before I kind of want to go systematically through these issues you've been covering. But before I do that, I just want to give a disclaimer to my audience and to whoever's listening that, very similar to how a few years ago, if you try to point out from a fact-based perspective what we know about police violence and its racial profile in America, referencing the Washington Post database, the Guardian database, studies by Harvard economists, and your conclusions didn't match the popular conclusions of the BLM moment, immediately people would say, well, what are you, defending white supremacy? What are you, pro-racism? Something very similar is happening now with Epstein, where when someone like you comes along and just says, what do we actually know from the perspective of documented facts? Very quickly, the accusation is, oh, what are you, defending pedophiles? Why are you defending the pedophiles? Like, what motivates you? So I think before we get into any facts, can you give me a little about what's motivating you to cover this issue in the way that you are?
Yeah, there have been other issues I've covered in the past where I've certainly been inundated with scurrilous accusations that attempt to impugn motive first and foremost. So, for example, when I was one of the earliest, I would say, journalistic skeptics of the Trump-Russia collusion narrative, obviously that occasioned a torrent of charges that I was somehow compromised by Russia, that my motive was fundamentally somehow about advancing the interests of Russia, or even I was being paid in rubles, so on and so forth. And there have been similar reactions to things that I've done over the years that just engender this tsunami of defamation. But I do have to say, the Epstein story is sort of unique in the kind of defamation that it engenders, but because there is this element inherent to the story of quote unquote pedophilia, or at least perceived pedophilia, then when one's motives get impugned, obviously they're going to be impugned in the most depraved way possible, meaning I'm trying to cover up my own sexual lust for underage children or something to that effect. I mean, I can't tell you, not that I'm someone who extrapolates a whole lot from my online interactions, because that could lead people to go astray, I find. But I will just tell you that it's fairly unbelievable. I mean, the average person on the street would be amazed to see how many thousands of people every day just confidently declare me to be personally a pedophile. And I think a lot of people in the media, for reasons that you can probably understand, don't want to deal with that kind of pushback. They'll deal with some pushback, sure, but this is a different level of pushback, because even to have your name uttered in the same sentence with pedophilia is something that people don't even want to have to contend with, because even to refute it is to only amplify it further.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of what I am motivated by, yeah, I've had to come up with sort of elevator pitch on this, because people will often ask me, why do you even bother with this story? Well, my answer, I hope, is pretty simple. Number one, I feel that mass panic or moral panic and mass hysteria are unto themselves destructive.
Mm-hmm.
And we can go through a great many destructive ramifications of this Epstein story and the way that it's functioned in the public domain over the past 6 months or even over the past many years. Number two, I feel that the common understanding of what the Epstein story supposedly signifies has given rise to an extremely widespread misdiagnosis of what I would regard to be real political problems. So if one takes it on dogma that there really is this incredibly pervasive elite pedophile ring that is shielded from accountability at the highest levels of our government and other foreign governments, and legions of VIPs are ensnared in this blackmail operation to get them to do the bidding of whomever, often Israel, not always exclusively Israel is who the theory leads to, then that's going to shape how you understand downstream political problems to have been incubated or what they originated from. And I think that unto itself is a big problem. And there are also lots of civil liberties problems that I think have been attendant to this issue. And I, throughout the time that I've been somebody who engages in the public arena, have been very much attentive to civil liberties issues in a variety of contexts. So you might call it a civil liberties issue that after the production of these most recent quote unquote Epstein files, anybody who appears in them is assumed through this incredibly tenuous and specious guilt by association to somehow be implicated in pedophilic sex criminality. Now, I will say that I thought it was warranted in this instance to have maximum disclosure because of the unique resonance this issue has taken on. And unfortunately, that was going to be a casualty. However, if one approaches the document production rationally, one should be able to discern if anybody actually is implicated in pedophilic sex crimes. But of course, the general public is not going to use any real discernment. But there are other civil liberties issues, which we could go into detail if you'd like, having to do, for example, with the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, which was frankly one of the most shambolic trials I've ever had the misfortune of studying. The widespread just declaration that anybody who self-declares as a quote victim is thereby a victim with not a single bit of corroborative interrogation done as to the veracity of their claims. I think that runs afoul of just basic common sense, but it also leads to serious civil liberties infringements. And there's a chronic unwillingness to look at this issue from any of those angles. So that's what I feel, what I can perceive in my own mind to be what I'm motivated by. People oftentimes don't accept that. They love to fling all kinds of other extraneous things that I'm allegedly motivated by, but to the extent that I can access my own brain, that's what I'm motivated by.
Yeah. So first of all, I commend you for doing the work. Somebody has to do it. You are doing the unpopular thing, and in my opinion, the ethical thing. It is always hardest in the midst of a moral panic to go against the grain, especially when you can be labeled. If it's the 1950s, you're labeled a communist. If it's the 2010s, you're labeled a racist. If it's Trump Russia, you're labeled a Trump apologist.
Russian asset, Russian agent.
Russian asset. Yeah. So, you're taking an unpopular stand. I think it's the right stand. And I think...
But pedo, I mean, if you just get barraged with the word pedo over and over, again, that's almost in a category unto itself.
I agree.
Which is why, when I was a skeptic of the Russia stuff, or, I took a somewhat countervailing view on a lot of Ukraine war issues. Israel definitely obviously breathes a lot of strong opinion if you weigh in. There was some COVID stuff back in the day. There have been other sort of Me Too oriented things that maybe I've gone a little bit against the grain on. But when you're calling it pedo, I mean, that's like that's what people believe is the worst thing that anybody could ever possibly be.
Yeah, it's worse than a murder.
Which is why, for a long time, I was really the only one that I knew of any, prominence. Not that I'm the most prominent person, but I really knew of no one who was approaching this issue from anything remotely like the angle I was. I have gotten like whispers privately, as the months went by, suggesting some level of agreement. But even people who do privately agree don't want to subject themselves to the swine that's going to come their way if they were to engage in public from this perspective.
Yeah. So let's get into it, because I think people who haven't actually read your perspective on this, or the few handful of others, I'm not even sure how many there are, who are actually just looking at the facts, I don't even think people know how far the narrative has actually diverged from the facts. So let's just start here, because it's the genesis of the whole Epstein mythology. Is what precisely was Epstein accused and convicted of in 2008, and how do those actual convictions relate to the charge that he was convicted of, quote, pedophilia?
Okay, so there's something subtle here that I want to clarify. I'm happy, obviously, to get into the 2008 Florida conviction, but I wouldn't say that's actually the genesis of what might be called the Epstein mythology. To the extent that there is a genesis of what we might call the Epstein mythology, that stems from one single victim, which is Virginia Roberts Giuffre, or I should say alleged victim or purported victim. If I ever slip up and use the word victim in this podcast without qualifying it somehow, everybody listening should just imagine air quotes. So the mythology stems from Virginia Roberts Giuffre, which is like a separate issue, which we can talk about now if we want to talk about the origins of the mythology. So let me know which way you'd like to go.
Okay, let's start with Virginia, and then we'll go back to 2008.
Okay.
Who is Virginia? How credible are her allegations? What are her allegations?
Okay, so first and foremost, I'm really not exaggerating when I say she might be the least credible person who has ever walked God's green earth. Seriously, it's stunning how integral she was, because she's now deceased, to the propagation of this Epstein mythology that's gripping countries around the world. I mean, I keep hearing that the UK government might collapse as a result of this. Obviously, it's all anybody can seem to talk about in the United States. There are flare-ups in France, Norway, Australia. I mean, it's incredible. And doubly incredible is that virtually no one has ever bothered to do a dispassionate assessment of this person's claims and whether they stand up to scrutiny. And so the reason why I say that she's the genesis of the mythology is that the mythology was not really at full throttle or anything close to it in 2007, 2008, when Epstein pleaded guilty to two state-level prostitution charges in Florida. The mythology really only arose much later. To give you an exact date, December 30th, 2014, when Virginia Roberts Giuffre had a court filing submitted on her behalf by two lawyers, Bradley Edwards and Paul Cassell, the former being one of the paramount, quote, victim lawyers throughout this whole thing, who's become obscenely wealthy, of course, as did Virginia, ultimately become obscenely wealthy. Mansion in oceanfront mansion in Australia, palatial ranch estate, etc. But in that filing, which really only became public the next month, so we can probably date the mythology to January of 2015, she introduces what have now come to be known, or what would now be recognized as the foundational tenets of the popular Epstein mythology, which is that she claims that she was essentially trafficked as a child sexually trafficked as a child to scores of prominent individuals by Epstein and or Ghislaine Maxwell. She names two of those specific individuals, actually three, but two for our purposes are the most relevant: Prince Andrew and Alan Dershowitz, also Jean-Luc Brunel, the French modeling mogul. She claims that this was a blackmail operation of some kind. Obviously, these claims are very vague, impossible to corroborate. The lawyers who filed it were reprimanded fairly shortly thereafter for having accused, put the accusations against Dershowitz into the filing without doing basic due diligence. And and also she says that in addition to Andrew, Dershowitz, and Brunel, that there's this undefined group of others to whom she had also been trafficked. It was sort of an astonishing thing to see in a court filing because that's not really according to the rules and procedures. But she says princes, prime ministers, etc., also sexually preyed upon her as a child. Now, this caused a bit of a firestorm when it was publicized by the media in 2015, but it really gained traction as the years went by and the mythology sort of bloomed, right? There was almost virtually never any real corroboration for any of those stories, but it was bewildering to me, or not, I shouldn't say bewildering, it was maddening to me that when her posthumous quote-unquote memoir came out last October, it became an instant international bestseller, wall-to-wall media coverage in the UK, the US.
Yeah, it's in every airport I've been to in the past few months.
Yeah. I did a review of that actually for Unheard at the time in my own Substack. And nobody noted, except me, that I'm aware of, that the quote-unquote memoir that was produced by a ghostwriter was mostly a carbon copy with some cosmetic adjustments of a prior memoir manuscript that she had generated back in 2011 and 2012, where she made all kinds of salacious claims against all kinds of prominent people, accusing them of committing sex crimes against her, that she later had to concede, or rather her lawyers had to concede on her behalf, that she, quote, fictionalized the memoir. And she had to retract a bunch of claims therein. So when this latest memoir came out, they kind of massaged the wording a little bit to, I guess, insulate the publisher from legal liability. But it's just amazing. She recanted publicly the claims against Alan Dershowitz, whom she had accused of committing sex crimes against her on, she said, at least 6 separate occasions. She made these claims not just in casual banter, but in depositions and affidavits filed under oath, which means that she theoretically was liable for perjury charges. But of course, no prosecutor would do that in this climate. And she didn't just accuse Alan Dershowitz sort of perfunctorily. She described each instance of alleged victimization by him in vivid graphic detail.
And what was the nature of her recanting? She admitted she had misremembered it, or what exactly was it?
So the statement was worded in a way so that the lawyers and perhaps her could claim like a sliver of plausible deniability. The precise way it was worded was that she, quote, may have made a mistake in identifying Dershowitz as the person to whom she had been subjected to these child sex crimes. I mean, really? You misidentified somebody who you're claiming effectively raped you on 6 or 7 occasions? So there you have it. That was the nature of it. Dershowitz actually did not seek any financial remuneration from that settlement because this came about over the course of very intense, almost tedious, years-long litigation. But it was 8 years after the fact, right? So she introduces this claim against Dershowitz in late 2014. Only by late 2022 did she recant it. And the recantation got very, very little coverage. Still doesn't get hardly any coverage as far as I could tell. Still, her claims are treated with the utmost credulity. She appears in all these She appeared, past tense, in all these documentaries, BBC, etc. I'll just give you one more example of how insidious this is. There's this notorious interview that Prince Andrew did with Emily Maitlis of the BBC in 2019. You might have seen it. People went wild for that interview, where admittedly Prince Andrew does appear to be behaving a bit oddly when he's taking all these questions about whether he committed pedophilic sex crimes. But despite Emily Maitlis being heralded for what a journalistic triumph this supposedly was, really all she's doing is pantomiming what Virginia Roberts Giuffre's lawyers would ask Prince Andrew in that situation to try to fish for material that could be used for civil litigation against him, which was ultimately brought in 2021. And Virginia Roberts Giuffre got this enormous settlement from the British royal family, who foolishly thought that would resolve the issue back in 2022, early 2022, ahead of the Queen's Jubilee year, so they didn't want the PR nightmare. But of course, it didn't stem the issue at all. Conceding to this hysteria does not tend to actually staunch it. It only gives it further credence. So Virginia Roberts Giuffre, I mean, it's unbelievable. She's the linchpin of the mythology. Okay, obviously people have added more to it as the years have gone by, but she is fundamentally the linchpin. I'll just give you an example that's just come out as of January 30th from this most recent production of Epstein Files. You know, people all say they want transparency. Well, good, we got some of it finally. She was interviewed by federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York in September 2019 in anticipation of a forthcoming indictment against Ghislaine Maxwell. This was after Epstein was dead. And they're also looking into potential other co-conspirators, of whom they found none, beyond Maxwell. And whether even she was a co-conspirator, let's say, is highly questionable. But she was interviewed. Virginia Roberts Giuffre was interviewed by these prosecutors. And they memorialized their assessment of the interview in a memo that just came out, dated December 19th, 2019. And they don't even include her in the category of alleged victims that they're compiling. So in this memo, they're compiling lists of alleged victims. You got people who were abused by Epstein when they were children, people who were abused when they were adults, and then they can't even find a way to put her in one of those categories because she's so utterly lacking credibility that they seem almost astounded. So they found this is an internal memoranda, okay? So they didn't know the public was ever going to get this.
Right, and their incentive, to be clear here, their incentive is for her to be a credible witness that could help their case, in theory, right?
They, at this point, are desperate for any potential evidence they can muster that would allow them to prosecute somebody in lieu of Epstein, right? Because there was a giant political demand for that at the time. It was becoming like a huge pop cultural issue, like the Netflix specials and the social media kind of fervor around it. So yes, they were desperate. They were desperately looking for somebody. And also bear in mind, when Epstein dies in federal custody, that's a huge humiliation for the government. So they have to figure out some way to rectify that and deliver, quote, justice for the alleged survivors. So yeah, if Virginia Roberts Giuffre was actually credible, could actually be even minimally corroborated, that would be a huge gift to the prosecutors. But instead, you can tell how disconcerted they are because they have to acknowledge amongst themselves that there's no corroboration for the claim that she's ever been trafficked to any prominent individual. A core prong of the whole Epstein mythology. There's no credence to the idea that she had also been promoting that Epstein surreptitiously hooked up surveillance cameras in all his rooms and all his properties to record prominent individuals in compromising sexual encounters and then blackmail them. They found no evidence for that. And furthermore, they also document that she had blatantly lied about many key facts, that she made up that she had been told by the FBI that there was a serious death threat against her. They say the FBI told her no such thing. In fact, they told her the precise opposite. There were no credible threats against her. So she went around lying about that. They say she lies to the media through outright falsehoods and just chronic sensationalizing. And so clearly they discount the viability of calling her to testify in any criminal proceeding. And indeed, she was not called to testify at the ultimate trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. But despite being the person who introduced this idea that Maxwell was the madame for Epstein and trafficked young girls to him and likely others, because she claimed she was trafficked by Maxwell to Epstein. So she was available to testify, but she was told that she was not going to be called to testify, and they put a sanitized version of why she was not called to testify in this bogus book that came out a few months ago, saying, "Oh, it was just like a strategic calculation by the prosecutors to make sure they had a streamlined case." Give me a break. So again, people should just be aware. And believe me, there's plenty more I could say about VRG, as I call her for short. People should be aware that to the degree that you perceive to exist, like common conceptions of what the Epstein thing entails, by and large, it originates with this one person who I would think any rational observer would have to conclude is so lacking in credibility that it's almost laughable.
Yeah. Okay. So with that said, let's go back to the beginning of the timeline. The first event that's important to actually accurately describe to people and will be surprising if you're just, reading Epstein headlines in the mainstream media or imbibing the rumor mill from your friends or from your Twitter feed. The facts of Epstein's conviction will probably be surprising to you in that you don't get a straightforward conviction for pedophilia out of it. So can you describe to me exactly what he was actually convicted of?
Yeah, nobody thinks that they have to actually be precise in terms of the legalities of what Epstein was convicted of. It's bizarre. Now, because he's dead, there's no potential for a libel suit to be brought because, that becomes moot upon a person's death. Although maybe an estate can sue, I'm not sure. Either way, there's just no even notion that anybody should just characterize what he was convicted of or what he pleaded guilty to accurately. So I saw that. So the New York Times, for example, and this is just one example that I happened to see. I was reading an article that was totally unrelated to Epstein. This was maybe last November. And then there's just some random reference to Epstein shoehorned in, and they just offhandedly call him a convicted sex trafficker. He was not a convicted sex trafficker. Sorry. You may think, or you may want to suppose or conjecture that he was a sex trafficker, but it's just factually false and legally false to say that he was ever a convicted sex trafficker. He was indicted for sex trafficking offenses in 2019, then died in custody. But people, and it's also ubiquitously claimed that he was a convicted pedophile. Now, believe me, I'm not somebody who, all other things being equal, would be particularly eager to litigate the nuances of the definition of pedophilia, because that never really ends well for anyone. But it happens to be relevant as to the most dominant political story that's engulfing the country and, it's in large part the world at the moment. So it is kind of important to look into the ins and outs of it. And so if you want to say that he's a convicted pedophile, then you should know what exactly he was convicted of, right? Then you could judge whether that aligns with the characterization of convicted pedophile. So what was he convicted of? Okay. So there was a very convoluted legal process or criminal investigation started in 2005 after the Palm Beach police opened an investigation into Epstein. And one thing led to another, and the local police in Palm Beach felt that the state attorney's office in Florida was not handling the case correctly or was not seeking a severe enough punishment against Epstein because the state prosecutors decided to bring the matter to a grand jury. And in 2006, the grand jury indicted Epstein for solicitation of prostitution, felony solicitation of prostitution, essentially, which, although a felony, is not one of the most grave crimes in the Florida criminal code, but that's what the state prosecutors came up with. So the Palm Beach police and their sort of affiliates complained to the feds, and then in 2006, the feds decided to intercede under the auspices of Alex Acosta, who was then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, later Labor Secretary in the first Trump administration, who then resigned because after Epstein's arrest, there was such a renewed frenzy around Epstein and allegations that Acosta somehow corruptly gave him a lenient deal, which is also a huge misconception. Just to summarize, ultimately what he did plead guilty to, pursuant to a non-prosecution agreement that was brokered with the feds, fairly unusual actually in terms of the legal minutia. So the feds intercede. They threaten that they're going to federally indict Epstein unless he accedes to a non-prosecution agreement, by which terms he would have to then plead guilty to 2 state-level charges in Florida. Also, he would have to agree to a structured resolution mechanism for civil claims against him by government-identified victims. So not victims that had been adjudicated as victims, but victims that the government claimed it had identified as victims. And he had to waive his ability to contest the litigation and also pay for their attorney's fees. And he would have to serve a term of incarceration, which he did for about 13 months. Including, and I didn't know this until the new files came out, because part of an interview that he did with Steve Bannon, bizarrely enough, came out. And he recounts that during part of his incarceration, he was in solitary confinement. Now, people say, oh, he got such a sweetheart deal or a lenient deal. I don't know. Solitary confinement doesn't seem that lenient to me. And you know what also doesn't seem lenient? The requirement to register for life as a sex offender, which he also had to agree to, which is onerous beyond belief for anybody who has to deal with that. There are different rules and regulations and even sort of informal customs associated with every jurisdiction in the United States having to do with the sex offender registry. Starting in around 2012, there also came about that there was a new requirement for international travel where the country to where a registered sex offender is traveling has to like do it in advance notice to the country. And it's always a mess. Like, it's not streamlined at all.
Michael, can I interrupt you for a second? Can you can get back to that in a second, but can you describe exactly what it is that he pled guilty to?
Sorry. As you could probably tell, I could talk about like so many strains of this all day and night. So exactly what he pleaded guilty to is discoverable to people who would like to know. People seemingly don't want to know, but it is discoverable information. I got it by simply going to the Florida court docket. You know, the system is available on the internet, and reading the relevant transcript. So all you have to do is read the June 30th, 2008 transcript of his plea hearing in Palm Beach County, Florida, where he entered his guilty plea. If anybody would like a copy of the transcript, feel free to contact me. And in that hearing, the charges are spelled out by the state attorney, and they're accepted by the judge. And the first charge, felony solicitation of prostitution, which he was indicted for in 2006, that doesn't refer to any particular victims, right? Or any particular age of any victims. It's just a standalone felony solicitation of prostitution statute. But then, at the behest of the feds, a second state-level violation was added, and that was procuring person under 18 for prostitution. Person singular. And the person who was identified to whom Epstein procured for prostitution while they were under 18 was a particular person. She didn't really do anything wrong. She's not one of these people who have seemed to make a whole livelihood out of being an alleged Epstein victim. I haven't heard a single thing from her since 2008 or even earlier. And I find her credible, actually. Unlike, for example, Virginia Roberts Giuffre or a multitude of others who have tried to cash out on this whole thing. Because you can watch her interview with the Palm Beach police investigator from when she had by then turned 18. You can read the transcript of her testimony to the grand jury that she was summoned to give, actually under protest, because she had no interest in prosecuting Epstein. She said that her sexual encounters with him were consensual. She was a bit unusual in that Epstein often didn't have full intercourse with any of these girls, but he did with her, she said, literally the day before her 18th birthday. People are going to think I'm making this up, but check the record. And there had been some sexual contact prior to that as well, but in terms of the full-blown sexual intercourse, it was the day before her 18th birthday. Florida has the highest age of consent in the country and the world. Only a handful of states have an age of consent that's 18. I'm in New Jersey right now. It's 16. New York is 17. It's 16 throughout New England. It varies. California is also 18, but then Washington State is 16, etc. So it was unlawful in Florida to have sexual contact with this girl. And his lawyers also didn't even try to undermine her credibility, which they did for some others. So that's what he pleaded guilty to. That was the victim that was identified in that proceeding.
Okay, so I just
So
want
if
to make
people
sure.
want to say that that constitutes pedophilia,
Mhm.
and it would have been legal in
Across the border in
37
Georgia.
states in the United States in terms
Right.
of the lawfulness of consensual sexual activity with that person. Now, if it was could be called prostitution or commercial sex acts or trafficking or something, that would be a different story. But in terms of just like on its face, consensual sexual activity between an adult of any age and a nearly 18-year-old who's technically 17, that is, I'm sorry to say, legal in the vast majority of US states. And if you don't like that, then petition your state legislatures to change it. But that's just true.
So I just want to plant a flag, people, so people right here, so people understand what Epstein. If you look at the entirety of what Epstein was convicted of and pled to in 2008, and you look in that bag for anything that could even plausibly resemble pedophilia, anything that has a colorable claim to be pedophilia, the only thing you really grab out of that bag is a plea of having consensual sex with someone who was turning 18 the next day, and she said it was consensual sex. And across the border in Georgia, that would have been a run-of-the-mill prostitution case, as probably happens thousands of times a day all over the country. But
If it was
because
charged at all, which
if it was
the
charged at
vast
all,
majority of the
it would
time
have been a simple adult procuring an adult prostitute.
actually,
But
if it took place if the conduct to which he pleaded guilty in Florida took place in New York, where he also was much of the time, it could have been as minor as a civil infraction, so akin to a traffic ticket.
Right. So this is when people say he is a proven pedophile, a convicted pedophile, this is what they're referring to. Of course, most people don't know this because they haven't actually read the transcripts, and they assume that if everyone says it and mainstream media outlets repeat it, well, therefore, someone must have done this original research to see that he really was convicted of something universally agreed upon to be pedophilia. But that's just not the case. Now, he was clearly a sleazy guy. There's no doubt about it. I have no temptation to actually defend his behavior on ethical grounds. But if we're talking about the actual facts of what is proven here, as opposed to if you're satisfied with rumor and conjecture, then I suppose I can't really help you. But if you actually care about what's true about the world and what's true about a mass panic, that's the extent of what was proven.
Yeah, and just to steel man the argument that people will make, even though they don't really make it very intelligently or they don't seem to have done any comprehensive research, but the argument that people will make to claim that the Palm Beach sort of phase of this Epstein legal odyssey does show that he was a pedophile was that there were other victims identified by the government as victims, right? So not adjudicated as victims because, and that's sort of an important qualifier, right? Because in order to say somebody's convicted of something or something has been proven, at least in a criminal context, it requires cross-examination, it requires adversarial testing of evidence, et cetera. But the government, it's long been claimed in just the popular media coverage. And by the way, let's not only single out the mainstream media. The alternative podcast style media is almost flagrantly, almost even worse on this.
Good point.
With their lack of standards in terms of how they discuss this issue. But there were approximately 35, 32, 36, it always varied a little bit, alleged victims that the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office claimed that they had identified around this period as people whom Epstein allegedly had victimized. The 17-year-old, who actually was credible. I mean, she's very unique in that, she's just straightforwardly credible. Almost every other one that I've ever looked at, there's a problem with, but not her. So it stands to reason that Epstein would have pleaded guilty to having a sexual interaction with her, right? But although it's just sort of repeated ad nauseum that the 30-something alleged victims were somehow just definitively established to have been victims, some of these new files actually shed additional light. And there's lots of new files actually that came out in July of 2024, pursuant almost to like a state-level Florida-style Epstein files legislation that was signed into law by Ron DeSantis and permitted the unsealing of records. including grand jury records, which are otherwise presumptively sealed. A lot of this sheds light on why it is that federal prosecutors who had interceded in the state level case determined that the best course of action to resolve the case was to compel Epstein to plead guilty to a non-prosecution agreement rather than move forward to trial, or to indict him and then potentially go to trial, because they were extremely wary that they could lose a trial, that Epstein would be acquitted and face no penalty because of the evidentiary problems that both they and the Florida state prosecutors had discovered in their investigation of this matter. So, for example, many of the girls, and I'm using the term girls colloquially to just describe, young-ish females, not like always literally girls or children. Like, so, I don't know. People have challenged me on this, but I don't think it's that uncommon to say like a 19-year-old girl, but just girls. So let's say from roughly 16 to 22 or something like that. A number of those girls openly acknowledged that they lied about their ages to Epstein, and also they instructed other girls whom they brought to Epstein to participate in these sexualized massages. They instructed them to lie as well. And to strawman the case, the initial girl who prompted the Palm Beach police investigation as a result of her visit to Epstein's house in Palm Beach was in fact 14, but she had been told by Haley Robson, who is now, we're told, a survivor, who speaks at the press conferences in front of the U.S. Capitol and is always in the media, and who was then an adult. She told this girl, Sage Gonzalez, to lie about her age. And Epstein actually asked, "How old are you?" when she arrived, and she said 18. Now, does that mean I would therefore excuse or morally condone all of Epstein's behavior? No, because even if you're coming close to the line of what is technically the age of consent in Florida, and there could be an 18-year-old high school senior who is it's technically legal to have sex with, but it's probably imprudent to have them ferry into your house day in and day out for these massages, which weren't always massages. Some girls would be speaking to investigators and saying, "Yeah, I just gave a massage." It was a little weird maybe, but there was no sexual contact. But as time would go on and they would come back for more sessions, often it would escalate in terms of the sexual entreaties that he made. Would I condone that? No. But with the 14-year-old, she only went once. There was no real overt sexual contact that was ever established. And, but she did strip down basically to her bra, which again, I would not say that it's a great idea for a man in his 50s to put himself in a position where that could even be a possible thing that he's involved with. But we got to put it in, we got to look at it proportionately. Is this something that we should be having this massive pedophilia crisis over now in 2026, 7 years after the guy died and 20-something years after the offenses in question, to which he pleaded guilty already, served a term of incarceration that was actually fairly stringent, had to register for life as a sex offender, paid millions and millions of dollars. I mean, no. To me, I would contend that is not a sufficient basis to proclaim, as so many people do just so flippantly and casually, that we are now in the throes of this unpunished mass-scale pedophilia crisis. And of course, there were other girls the government identified who were also under 18. Their stories always varied. Some of them said they lied about their ages. Some of them had fake IDs. Others claimed they didn't lie about their ages. So Epstein was, I would say, reckless and impulsive at the time. Ghislaine Maxwell says in her proffer interview last summer with the Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, that he was taking large amounts of testosterone around this period, which might have affected his judgment and also his sex drive in ways that weren't particularly reasoned. But in the main, come on,
Michael,
people.
Can I interrupt you?
Yeah, sorry.
There's so many elements of this myth that I'm just mindful of the time and wanting to get to other aspects of the myth here.
I can go for as long as you'd like, just so you know.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I think we've dealt enough with 2008 and what was actually true there and what people imagine was true. I guess one thing I want to talk about is, so since the Epstein files came out, we've seen that obviously Epstein was an aggressive social networker. He loved meeting scientists. He loved funding people's science projects or being about to fund. He was at TED and all this stuff. And this is kind of how he bought his social life and his influence and so forth. And so all these people have email correspondence with him from the 2010s, essentially. And what I
and
want
earlier, but yeah, there's a lot of 2010 stuff.
And so all this stuff is after the conviction, but before the Epstein story has become a
some of it is from before,
story.
From other files that have come out, probably in this latest iteration as well. But just to clarify, but a lot of the stuff that's come out that's seen as new and revelatory did take place after the 2008 conviction.
So what I want to ask you is, like, imagine you're a scientist, you meet Jeffrey Epstein at TED in like 2015 or something, or 2013 even. What was it possible for you to know based on the public record? Say, I met this guy Jeff at TED. I want to Google him. He wants to have dinner with me. Like, so put aside whether you would actually Google someone you had just met at a conference to have dinner with, because that's not always how life works. Sometimes you just have dinner with the person. But let's say you wanted to do a little bit of due diligence. Who is this guy? What would you have come across at that time? And like, what would have been clear to you about this person? Would it have been obvious that, you know, all this stuff was true?
So if you spent like a half hour Googling in 2015, you would have found some stuff that, if you are hyper scrupulous in ensuring that you never associate with anybody who could be seen as morally sullied in any way, maybe you would have chosen not to associate with him. But I don't know.
What would it have been, like a Miami Herald article?
No, that would have been later, actually.
So
that was 2018. I mean, the big series that prompted the sort of reinvigoration of the Epstein story and actually impelled the federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York to try to re-prosecute Epstein federally. No, this was before. So, for example, there was some coverage of his 2008 plea hearing. I don't remember following that at the time, actually, but you could read stuff in the New York Times where it's like, wealthy financier pleads guilty to underage prostitution charge in Florida. There was like New York Post tabloid stuff, where some of which was turned out not to be true, sort of suggesting that maybe he informed on Bear Stearns to get him an easier deal. That never got borne out. You could, if you wanted to do like if you want to go beyond a Google search and like go to LexisNexis or something, then you could have found a decent amount of civil litigation filed by Jane Doe's. Mm-hmm. Like Virginia Roberts Giuffre had filed her initial lawsuit as a Jane Doe against Epstein individually by that time. And she hadn't introduced her most outrageous claims yet, but she did claim to be victimized. But in terms of what you could know in terms of what he actually pleaded guilty to, which is the standard that I would think is the most rational one, if you're going to have a standard at all in terms of evaluating this stuff, it's exactly what I just said before, although probably all of that wouldn't have been available at that time. You could have just
the detail wouldn't have been available. Just
no, it wouldn't have been available.
Right?
You could still find theoretically the crimes to which he pleaded guilty, which were prostitution offenses. I think people have to bear in mind that virtually everything that would have been considered prostitution, including statutorily in 2008, which is not that long ago, is today considered presumptively to be, quote, trafficking. Like, prostitution is almost like a taboo thing now to classify any of these activities as, because it seems to demean the quote unquote prostitute. But back then, if somebody got caught up in a prostitution charge, it's not really the end of the world. Elliot Spitzer was the governor of New York in 2008 and had to resign as a result of patronizing prostitutes. If he had happened to be governor in 2026 and the same thing was found out, he'd probably be federally indicted for trafficking. So that's what people would have known. And when he would be asked about it by people, and when he would explain it to people, he would say that he felt like he got a raw deal. Mm-hmm. That girls lied to him about their ages, and the feds came hard after him, and he was sort of forced to plead guilty to these prostitution charges. Right. So that's basically what they would have known. And yet now, anybody who so much as exchanged like a lighthearted email with him, they must be banished from society? Really? And, you said before, this is how he purchased his friendships or something. Well, yeah, the guy obviously did have a lot of money, and he used that to facilitate his social life. There's no doubt about it. But, I think if we want to be fair, if we want to actually be impartial and scrutinizing the record, a lot of people seem to actually really enjoy him. Mm-hmm. He did seem to be actually quite intelligent. He was sort of a math prodigy.
There's no way he could have that many friendships with that many people if he wasn't charismatic in person, right? I don't think...
And intelligent, I would say.
Money just buys you that many emails from that many people in that sort of position.
He was able to set up meetings. He was able to set up a meeting of the minds between Noam Chomsky and Steve Bannon. I'm sorry, I'm kind of jealous of anybody who's able to facilitate that meeting. So, and it just goes to show, like, if all he is to anybody who ever looks at this issue in any respect is just this like mega super villain, then again, it's not to absolve Epstein for anything he ever did in his entire life. But if you want to have like an accurate picture, you got to be like a little bit empathetic as to why people would have associated with him, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, I mean, I think people are kind of deluding themselves here because first of all, I've been to TED several times. I've been to many conferences like TED. I've probably met literally hundreds of people at those conferences and had very friendly conversations with many of them. I don't know almost anything about most of their backgrounds. I've been invited to dinners by people. I've been, people very often, they meet you at a conference. They say, hey, can I have your email? It's very hard to say no. There's many times where I've wanted to say no. Many times where I've wanted to say no. I always say yes. But I give my email. I'm a wuss about that too. And, I've had dinner with people that I don't know that much about. I've had dinner with people that I have not done more than a 5-minute Google search on.
Yeah, like what should we ask everybody we meet now? Have you ever been convicted of a sex offense?
Yeah, right. So I think people are working backwards from what they think they know about Epstein to how it would have been rational to behave had they met Epstein in 2015. But really, if you had met him at a conference and God forbid he was charming and you had an interesting conversation, he asked for your email at the end of it, probably you would have said yes. At most, someone like me would have done a 5-minute Google search because that's about the extent of my due diligence to have dinner with someone I met at a conference is maybe less than a 5-minute Google search.
I'll just come clean about something. So if I had Googled him in 2015, let's say I had been invited to a soiree at his house with some interesting people because he was able to convene all these high-profile, interesting people from different fields, right? If I had been invited and I did the Google, actually, I would have already heard about him at that point. But let's say I knew like the best approximation of what I could possibly know in 2015. I still would have gone. You know why? Mm-hmm. I reject this idea that if I go and meet somebody or even have like a friendly rapport with them and they did something in their life that people find objectionable, that I'm somehow therefore complicit in anything.
Right.
Like unless I committed a sex crime, unless I did something morally objectionable, I'm not indicted by what somebody else has done just by mere association. It's guilt by association. It's literally what people did. It's literally about what people were accused of in the Salem witch trials. Like if you were approximate to a witch, then because she emanates this magical evil spell, you're contaminated and therefore you're under suspicion for being a witch. I mean, I have to just reject the underlying logic.
Right.
That an association is unto itself morally inculpating.
I think next time someone makes this argument, you should try the Mike Tyson argument on them, right? How many people have associated with Mike Tyson? If Mike Tyson asked me to dinner, I would fucking get dinner with Mike Tyson, absolutely. Now, this man was convicted of rape.
Much more serious than anything Epstein was
in the 90s, which is absolutely it's horrible, right?
Ted Cruz did try to use that against Donald Trump in the 2016 Indiana Republican primary, and it didn't work because Trump was a friend of Mike Tyson's.
Yeah, and so I wouldn't automatically banish someone from my life because I knew that they had a charge in their past and they had done time, and in fact, I would have thought the entire spirit of criminal justice reform of the past many years, portrayed in its best light, would suggest you don't banish people from your life simply on the knowledge that they have a prior conviction. So the judgment of these people...
That's exactly what Noam Chomsky said when he was first asked about his association with Epstein in 2023, when it was first sort of found out about, at least certain details were. And unlike all these other people who issued these groveling public apologies and affirm how sympathetic they are for all the victims and they regret ever meeting him and all these like PR crafted mea culpas, Chomsky's really the only one that I know of who was actually rather abrasive and dismissive of this idea that he had anything to atone for. He actually said, look, I knew that he had been convicted of something. He paid his debt to society, or he served his sentence. And according to the norms of our constitutional order, you would think that means the slate is wiped clean, he said, in terms of his ability to re-enter society. And I think that's absolutely right. But of course, now Chomsky, because more emails have come out since this latest DOJ production, he's literally being renounced. 97 years old, debilitated by a stroke, can't even defend himself. One of, whether you're left wing or right wing, whether you agree or disagree with anything that he's done politically, or if you have a different linguistics theory, you have to acknowledge that he's among the most, if not the most, titanic intellect of our age. And because he had this friendship, which was actually a closer friendship than I ever knew, but it turns out it was actually a rather robust friendship with somebody who pleaded guilty to a prostitution charge, or two of them, like 10 years prior to them meeting. Now all his co-authors and people who have, been allied with him politically and loved him for all these years, they're coming out and denouncing him. It's actually revolting. It's especially revolting for him because of his incapacitation, but it's just one manifestation of how destructive this moral panic is.
It's what's amazing is that Chomsky has lived long enough to be not only the subject of quasi-McCarthyite witch hunts in the 60s for opposing the Vietnam War, but he's lived long enough to survive into a whole different flavor of guilt by association. I mean, the really disgusting part of this is the assumption that anyone who knew Epstein or was friends with him was therefore part of some global pedophile ring and is guilty of heinous sexual crimes against minors. I mean, this is, maybe I'm so Twitter-brained that this is not as big a phenomenon as it seems to me, but the level of residue that's wearing off on literally hundreds of people that are not even accused of, they don't even have a single accuser. And yet they're being casually referred to as a part of this network of criminality is just really, it's really terrible.
Yeah, and people don't even distinguish between the scope of, or the closeness of the relationship. So it's anybody who exchanged an email. There were people who had sort of long-standing social relationships with Epstein. Donald Trump was one of them. Mm-hmm. Bill Clinton, not really. I mean, Bill Clinton did fly on Epstein's plane, and Ghislaine Maxwell was really the conduit for that, but they didn't have a social or personal relationship as far as anybody could tell.
Now, let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
Is there evidence that, so is the picture of Epstein's island that Epstein was basically getting lots of, basically there were prostitutes on the island and people could come to the island and pay for sex from adult prostitutes? Is that picture accurate?
No, not quite. And
what do we know about
even
the
that
island,
picture
then?
Is a much less hyperbolic picture than what people tend to believe must be true about the island, right? Because one of the problems with this whole story is that everything gets conflated. So because of the whole thing in Palm Beach that we went through, people conflate that with everything that also must have gone on the so-called pedophile island or rape island. I mean, we have people in Congress, I'm sure as we speak, and definitely the two lead champions of Epstein files disclosure, Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, they run around constantly and will just flippantly throw out the phrase rape island. And so can somebody just ask them? I think I have asked Ro at least, or maybe I didn't ask this question, but I should have. Maybe I will next time. Okay, can you tell us who was raped on the island? Don't you think that answer would be forthcoming at this point, given all the journalistic resources poured into this story, the legal, wildly extensive legal proceedings, criminal proceedings, civil proceedings, etc., congressional investigations? Okay, who was raped at the island? And nobody has an answer, because there's really no credible evidence that anybody was raped. There are rumors. There are vague things that have been claimed by mentally ill people. But to the extent that, and to the degree that anybody ever was engaged in, let's say, untoward sexual activity on the island, I've never seen any evidence, and I've looked at a lot of it, that any of the sex participants were minors. Not the case for Palm Beach, but in terms of the U.S. Virgin Islands, I please send me the evidence. What he would do is he was involved in the modeling industry, because remember, his benefactor was Leslie Wexner. His main benefactor was Leslie Wexner, who was the owner of outfits like Victoria's Secret, The Limited. And Epstein was his money manager. He ran all his finances. So people ask, how did he get his money? Well, I don't know. If you're the money manager for one of the wealthiest people in the United States, and also you have some other clients, seems like you could make a pretty good living from that, especially if you're sort of preternaturally skilled, like Epstein evidently was, in complex financial maneuvers, which is why he was promoted in his early to mid 20s to a relatively senior position at Bear Stearns in the early 80s. But so through his modeling sort of contacts, like that Jean-Luc Brunel guy, the French modeling impresario, or I don't even know what you would call him, he would meet these women, younger women, attractive, who would get involved in his orbit or operation. And, one thing would lead to another. And they would be invited to travel on his private jet to the island. And yeah, I'm sure certain sexual things would probably take place. But in terms of like rape, I mean, the only even real like thoroughly documented accusation of rape that I'm pretty sure I'm aware of is from this one person, Sarah Ransom, who totally delusional. Like, I'm not even saying that to be pejorative. Like, it's just objective to anybody who looks at it.
So what's the evidence of her lack of credibility?
Well, part of it is that she ends up being, whenever anybody points to an allegation that stems from her, it's assumed that it somehow would constitute pedophilia. But she was a 22-year-old, basically escort, living in New York City in around 2004, who, prior to her meeting Epstein, was associated with what she calls an agency that would set her up to go have dinner, quote unquote, with gentlemen, quote unquote, and she'd be paid $1,500. And sometimes she said this in a deposition, not in any of her public appearances, obviously, or on Netflix or Hulu, but in the deposition, when she was asked, she said that sometimes she would have consensual sex with these quote unquote gentlemen because she found them attractive. So she gets involved. She meets somebody who then refers her to the Epstein operation. She goes to the island, and she, she has.
Now, when you say Epstein operation, I don't want people to mistake what you're saying there. What's the operation? Is it getting
that's
escorts
maybe not
to be on the island so that these guys can do escort stuff with them?
Oftentimes what would happen is that a woman would meet another woman who was maybe knew that Epstein liked to have people come and give him a massage of some kind, or like wanted to meet these younger women. He was a rich guy, right? He was also a philanthropist, so maybe he could fund something that they were working on. A lot of these younger women got their college tuitions paid for, or he would fund like certain art projects or theatrical projects, etc. So there would be like referrals made to go meet him. So that's what I meant by operation. Sometimes he did have employees who, did just handle his personal affairs, accounting, management of his properties, management of his personal schedule, et cetera, who would meet, somebody and then invite them. So that's what I meant by operation. Nothing that grandiose, but I don't even know. But you would think, just based on the pop cultural portrayal of that island, that it was just like a systematic rape factory. Like, it was a site of the most, it was like the biggest mass rape crime scene in all of human history. And there's really nothing to support that I can see.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems from reading between the lines of the Epstein files, he had an island, he threw parties, he invited people he met all around the world to these parties. It's probable that he tried to keep the ratio of these parties to have lots of young but adult women, some of whom were actual escorts. And presumably that was part of the attraction of coming to party on the island. And all of that is a far cry from pedophile rape island. You can be as judgmental of it as you want. You can be as judgmental of people coming to the parties, assuming, we don't know that all of their expectations were in the sexual domain. I mean, presumably a lot of them were coming to party, right? Like Elon Musk was coming with his wife, right? Or was wanting to come with his wife. But does that picture seem plausible?
It wasn't so much, as I understand, that he really threw parties. They were mostly, I would say, like little powwows or soirees. So if I'm remembering that Elon Musk exchange correctly, Epstein's asked him, "Are you going to come to the island?" And Musk says, "I would like to go somewhere and really party hard," which means the Epstein Island wouldn't be where he would go. He would go someplace else because that wouldn't be the party, hard charging party he was looking for, right?
Right.
So he would have these little confabs, let's say, where he would invite like a handful of prominent people who would be like interesting to pair together. Like, Woody Allen was one of them. And there were, obviously many, many others who went with varying frequency. But parties, not really. And then in terms of the Palm Beach girls, right? There's really no evidence ever that they were brought to any kind of partying scenarios. It's a little bit different for some of the girls that would have gone to the house in New York or Palm Beach or maybe even Paris, who by and large would have been, rather sophisticated, like college-aged, approximately attractive girls. So, Michael Wolff, the journalist who knew Epstein, it seems to be the one who set him up with Steve Bannon first, connected him with Steve Bannon. He had gone to some of these soirees, starting around 2015, actually. And he would say, yeah, sometimes there would be girls there who were, college-aged, attractive, and would be kind of, let's say, a little bit decorative. They would be doing like little tasks to facilitate the party, like serving drinks or whatever. It doesn't mean like at every moment they were just like constantly throwing themselves on any guy and like running to have sex with them. But like, okay, maybe if some people are in a social setting, like something like that could happen. But I just make that clarification because I'm not sure that partying is quite the right way to put it. It was something a little bit more cerebral. Because would you just throw like a rave with a bunch of scientists? Probably not. Like you'd probably do something else in a social context.
Okay, so I want to get to a few other aspects of this myth. One is the blackmail aspect. This has to do, I guess we can deal with blackmail and the client list, the so-called client list at the same time. A few interrelated questions you can address. Is there any evidence that has ever surfaced about secret cameras on the island? That's number one. Was there any actual evidence that there was a client list to begin with? And if not, how did the idea of the client list take on such a huge size in the public imagination?
Yeah, so the client list has always just been like a figment of people's imaginations. It seems like public speculation around a so-called client list and also the adoption of that specific term really accelerated during the Biden administration. I think it had a lot to do with Elon Musk, actually. There was a tweet of his from 2022 where he's just responding to somebody about something to do with Ghislaine Maxwell. He's like, what about their client list? Why haven't any clients been prosecuted? Now, there had been chatter about a client list prior to that, but previously, it was mostly about this so-called little black book. Okay, so this was a book, quote unquote, that was purloined from Epstein's house in Palm Beach by one of his house attendants in 2009. And it was basically a contact book that Epstein's employees maintained in terms of it was like his Rolodex, essentially. Some people really didn't have a close association with Epstein, but maybe he met them once or he had a phone call with them or something. Some were closer associates. And for a while, to the extent anybody would talk about this or invoke the concept of a client list or even gesture towards something in that vein, what they would be talking about, as I recall, was the idea that the people listed in that so-called little black book, which eventually became public, must be his clients, right? And must be guilty of sex trafficking offenses or must be complicit in something, right? But then later on, weirdly enough, I don't know, it kind of morphed into this other sort of blinkered concept about a list of pedophiles that for some reason the government was keeping secret and was in its possession, and we need to like storm the barricades of the FBI to get it released. So there was this notorious quote of Kash Patel when he was a private citizen in late 2023 on a dopey podcast saying to the prior FBI director, Christopher Wray, put on your big boy pants and tell us who the pedophiles are, as though there was just a list of pedophiles sitting on his desk or in a safe somewhere that he could just crack open and immediately show to the public. And then we would know all the elite pedos who are ruling over us. But it's just a facet of what one would expect with a mythology, right? It kind of like morphs over time.
You know what it reminds me of, Michael? There's this book called Mount Analog that I found in an antique bookshop years ago. And the beginning of the plot is this guy writes an academic article called Mount Analog. And the idea of the article is it's sort of like an abstract metaphor. Like there is no actual Mount Analog, but he's talking about the use of analogies or something in some field. And someone reads the article and mistakenly thinks that he's talking about an actual mountain called Mount Analog. And then he writes to the professor, I'm so glad you believe in the existence of Mount Analog too. Let's go find it together. And then for some reason, the professor actually says, okay, maybe he like loses his mind and thinks that maybe there is a Mount Analog, and they go on this crazy adventure to find this mythical mountain. That's what the Epstein client list is. It
you should write that up.
It literally never existed, but people just kind of spoke it into existence and then firmly believed it so much that every failure for it to emerge became yet more evidence that it's being hidden.
Kind of gives you some insight into how maybe some world religions developed over the years, right?
That's true.
So client lists. I think there are even some people who are pretty invested in the issue who will acknowledge, okay, maybe the concept of a client list was not quite on target, but they'll say, but what about this X, Y, and Z? Like, for example, there's supposedly like lists of co-conspirators who were in this list of Epstein files during the first production of them on December 19th. There was an email came out that was, appeared to be between prosecutors or between people in the FBI. It's so annoying that they redact the email addresses for some reason, as though like those are like top secret material. And by the way, in terms of the excess redactions, just as an aside, if people are, annoyed by how expansive they are, that is exactly what was demanded in terms of the expansiveness of the redactions by the victims, quote unquote, and their lawyers in very fever-pitched court filings and petitions that were made in the Southern District of New York to ensure that as few possible Epstein files came out as possible. Now, if that strikes you as ironic, it should, because on the one hand, we're told that all these quote unquote victims and the lawyers representing them are very determined to get the maximum possible transparency and disclosure. But in fact, they're demanding that redactions be applied. And actually, the Bradley Edwards, the lawyer who is very central to the whole this whole process in so many ways, and represents, he says, endless victims. He actually demanded on like February 2nd that the DOJ take all the files down entirely because there was just too much disclosure.
So I mean, are they just redacting the names of alleged victims, or are they redacting more than that?
No, that's the thing. That's another fallacy, because you would think it would sound reasonable to most people. Oh, if they're just going to redact the names, then that sounds fine because we don't want to necessarily like re-victimize a victim. Although at this point, these are old offenses. So like, I mean, either you're in favor of transparency as I see it, or you're not. Like, I've always said I support full transparency.
Did the alleged victims demand that they redact more than their own names? Like all these redactions stem from the request of the alleged victims, even if it's more than their names. Is that what you're saying?
What Bradley Edwards, who represents these victims, wrote on what he said was their behalf, starting in November, actually predating November, but he summarized his whole case, or he laid out his whole case really most thoroughly in November, was that simply redacting the names was by far not enough.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be anything that could even tangentially, potentially identify something about a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And so, therefore, if you think about it for a second, wouldn't you expect that a lot of these materials, if we're getting like investigatory materials where charges were contemplated to be brought having to do with the alleged victimization of a particular victim, wouldn't you expect there to be like rather lengthy case files going through the allegations and the background of the alleged victim and like weighing the pros and cons as to their credibility and whether they could fit certain statutes, et cetera, right? So of course there's going to be material that is, quote, victim identifying. That's the weird coinage they came up with. Or when the DOJ and FBI said last summer when they produced this memo on July 6th, that caused this whole uproar, really, because they said in that memo, no client list, no blackmail, no additional co-conspirators against whom there's a predicate to bring charges, etc. They said in that memo that one reason why no further files would be released, at least at that time, was that too much of it was intertwined with, quote, the identifying information of alleged victims. So that's why they had to go through this laborious redaction process for the past, for like before the January 30th, like the prior 5 or 6 weeks.
So is the punchline here, Michael, that like presumably some of the stuff redacted makes the alleged victims look a lot more like willing participants?
Either that, it cast doubt on aspects of their credibility. It just gives contrary information to this image that's been created of them in this hyper-credulous media environment where a lot of journalists just see their role as nothing more than to be PR vehicles for alleged victims. They should be called survivors. Like, what does that even mean, survivor? It's so melodramatic. Really? So some of these people are survivors of, like, having given a massage with their bra on? Okay. So the reason why I would theorize this lawyer in particular was so adamant about his demands for redactions is because he and his colleagues, David Boies, another high-powered lawyer, they've brought a bunch of incredibly lucrative lawsuits against not just Epstein and his estate, but also major financial institutions like J.P. Morgan and Deutsche Bank and others. And they filed 2 brand new ones in October of last year against Bank of America and Bank of New York Mellon. And should information come out through these Epstein Files productions that might undercut the veracity of the claims that they're making on behalf of alleged victims, or even like potentially identify this or that victim, then that will give a leg up to these financial institutions to contest the class action lawsuits. So they don't want that. So a lot of it is like profit motivated. That's another aspect of this that's just covered by no one ever.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about this. Is there a financial incentive to claim victimhood here? And could you describe that?
There's an enormous one. It's mind-boggling to me that this is never discussed. I would estimate that if you tallied everything up somehow, and it's hard to do because some of the, there are secret settlements, some stuff is confidential in terms of the payouts that people get. But I would estimate that if you tallied it all up, the Epstein industry, so to say, my own shorthand little coinage, is like $1 billion industry.
$1 billion? Jesus Christ.
Crazy, right? Definitely north of like 600 million. And again, if we had the full accounting, up to $1 billion. And that's not all coming from Epstein himself, right? It's coming from other institutions that were claimed to be liable for Epstein's...
Is this all from the civil vehicle that was set up in 2008 to pay money to victims that didn't have to adjudicate?
No, my friend. That was like a pittance. That was a drop in the bucket. That was barely anything. It all, the vast majority of it really came after Epstein's death because then he can't contest any claims, right? And also he can't sue anybody for libel, which is convenient.
So did that come from his estate?
It came from his estate, yes. That paid out around $130 million. His estate's still getting sued, by the way, by people who did not participate in the original class action settlement program that was established in 2020. I know for a fact that a settlement from his estate was given as recently as last June, and there could be more. You never know.
So is an aspect of this that the fact that he's dead means there's no risk in making an accusation but
Pretty
there's
much.
much to gain in making an accusation?
And also the settlement program that was established in terms of the estate. So giving alleged victims a vehicle to obtain a payout through Epstein's estate domiciled in the Virgin Islands. It was expressly in its court-approved protocols designed to be a non-adversarial and confidential mechanism. So the claims wouldn't be adversarially scrutinized. They would be confidential. So if you embellish something or maybe even make something up, no problem, because it's confidential. Mm-hmm. And who's going to tell? And of course, the administrator of the settlement program, Simona Lelchuk, who I would love to talk to at some point if she happens to listen to this, is never going to make a criminal referral about a victim. Please. There were even, I can't get too specific about this, but I have it on good information that there were even people who applied to the Epstein Victims Compensation Program drawn from the estate who were rejected despite how lax the standards were, because they were just that lacking in credible, but they later got settlements elsewhere because the criteria were even less rigorous. So in terms of where does $1 billion come from that I'm postulating here, you got the Epstein Victims Compensation Program, which was around 130, probably at this point, I would say maybe 140 million. JP Morgan, which was 240 million, if I'm not mistaken. Deutsche Bank was another 90 million. You have individualized settlements against Epstein himself that predated his death, against Maxwell that predated her indictment. You have
all of this amounts to an enormous incentive to either lie, fabricate, or stretch the truth. And if you don't think anyone ever does that, then I'm not sure I can help you. But
it's not, that should be a truism of human nature that people would just immediately, intuitively recognize. If you can make a ton of money doing something, then you're going to have a strong incentive to do it. But on this story alone, nobody thinks that's a relevant factor to consider.
Right. Okay. The other element I want to get to here is, I guess you've covered this already, that there's no actual evidence there were secret cameras on the island. This is a widely
there's never. Okay, so just to maybe set the scene, I guess there was. Where did we know that Epstein had cameras? Okay, he did. It's pretty well established. They had a camera on his desk in the Palm Beach house because the police advised him to install a security camera after he was burglarized by one of his aggrieved former employees. So he actually worked with the police to set up that camera. So that's one camera that we know existed. But it wasn't in a bedroom or a bathroom or anywhere you would expect something sordid to be happening. It's pretty well established that there was a surveillance camera, at a standard location, sort of facing over his door in New York. And that's all that's really ever been known. But it's just become part of this folklore that we just know for certain somehow that he bugged every room. He had cameras in every room. And surely then he was ensnaring all these prominent people into his blackmail operation to record them in compromising sexual encounters with, children. So then he could hold it over their heads and get them to do who knows what. Fill in the blank. But it's just amazing to be there's never been credible evidence for any of this. Some of it originates from the fantastical, delusions of some of the alleged victims who claim that they saw this or they just somehow knew that these things existed. Particularly Maria Farmer, who was a certifiable nutcase, who we don't even have time to go into the reasons why. Although I'll just give you a brief example. Actually, you know what? I should give you a little bit of a summary here because she's one of the people who had claimed that all the rooms were bugged, or that there were cameras everywhere, and so there must be this voluminous blackmail material that we just need to be adventurous enough to figure out a way to locate, and then we'll be able to take down the entire governing elite of every country. So that's who people rely on. That's it's like a game of telephone. So she said something, and then it gets repeated. And she's somebody who claims that she was held captive on a compound in Ohio, and pedophilically raped by both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell when she was 26. So I'm not sure how she had this epiphany that she claims she had that night, that they were pedophiles if she was 26. She claims, despite being held in what she says was captivity or being kidnapped, that like family members of hers would like freely come and visit her on this compound. She claims that she was held in captivity by some combination of the Jewish mafia, whatever that means, Doberman retrievers, and snipers. And she claims also she was given multiple cancers by some combination of Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, among others. She claims that she was somehow victimized by Donald Trump because one day she was sitting in Jeffrey Epstein's office in New York and Trump moseyed on in, and she happened to be wearing running shorts, and Trump looked at her while she was wearing the running shorts, that therefore she felt that she was victimized by Trump.
That's the source of the secret camera idea, or is it?
She's the chief source of it, yeah. And Virginia Roberts Giuffre is also another source. So we went through some of her, let's say, credibility issues, but like I've never seen a credible source.
Okay, so this is maybe the third or fourth plank of the Epstein myth I want to tackle. Is
and
that
in the new files, right? There have been new information that's come out on this, thankfully. So we got some disclosure and transparency. The FBI basically concluded that there was no evidence. Like they found no cameras in any of these locations where you expect they would be in any of the properties. So New Mexico,
they were looking. They had reason to find them. Right?
New Mexico, New York, U.S. Virgin Islands, Florida.
So this idea that Epstein was intelligence, that's what I want to get to finally. And this is whether it's Mossad or whatever, Russia, the idea that he's intelligence has just become accepted in the Epstein lore. And if you challenge them, people will say, well, actually, Alex Acosta admitted it. And then, I'm sure you can talk about this, but in the little research I did, you try to track down the source of this Alex Acosta quote where he allegedly said, hands off Epstein. We have to give him a sweetheart deal in this non-prosecution agreement because I've been told he was intelligence. If you track down the footnotes on that, it's like literally Alex Acosta there's no recording of him saying it. There is no direct record of someone who heard him say it. It's like a secondhand reporting from the Daily Beast, and the person who allegedly heard it has never come out publicly and raised their hand and said, hey, I'm the person that heard Alex Acosta say this. So that was what I could determine from that. And the only time he's ever been asked on the record, he denies that it ever happened. So is that right? Tell me everything you know about the Alex Acosta source of him being intelligence and any credible thread of Epstein being intelligence.
Okay, so this is another central tenet of the folklore, I would say, especially online, because people on the internet seem especially enthused about this idea that he's an intelligence asset or is intelligence. Like, I don't even know, what does it mean to be intelligence? Like, nobody's really ever that specific about what they're asserting here. But yeah, the Acosta thing was definitely foundational to the proliferation of this lore. And that stemmed from a single Daily Beast article in July of 2019, written by Vicky Ward, a former tabloid trash journalist, I have to say, who for whatever bizarre reason, if you go look at the original article, decided not to emphasize this amazing bombshell scoop in the headline. Like, if I got a scoop saying Epstein belonged to intelligence or somebody else who was of high notoriety at some time, like, wouldn't I say, headline, hey, everybody, I just found out that this person belongs to intelligence, but she like buries it in the article. It's like a definition of this old journalistic cliche, burying the lead. And she never follows up on it, really, that I've ever seen in the many years that have ensued since July of 2019. There's never been any corroboration she's ever been able to produce. She sources it to a former senior Trump administration official who allegedly told her this 2 or 3 years before July of 2019. And if you read it closely, it's like quadruple hearsay. So it's her saying that somebody told her that they heard, or it's her. Sometimes I get this screwed up. It's her saying that somebody told her 2 or 3 years ago that they heard that Acosta said to others
Right.
that this happened in a Trump transition meeting after Trump won the 2016 election. And I've been able to surmise with a very high degree of certainty, although not 100% certainty, because there's not much we can be certain in life, but like reasonably high level of certainty that the person she's attributing this claim to is Steve Bannon, who at that point was a former senior Trump administration official, and has now this very elaborate relationship of his own that we now know of with Epstein, because Ward had been collaborating 2 or 3 years prior to July 2019 with Bannon on a book about Jared Kushner.
Hold on, let me stop you. Has Steve Bannon ever come out and said, I'm the one? Or has anyone from the Trump transition team... Has anyone from the Trump transition team ever come out and said, I'm the one, I'm the source?
Not that I know of. Steve Bannon has never addressed it to my knowledge. But you could find quotes of his, including in Michael Wolff's book for 2021, where Steve Bannon is directly quoted. And he says almost something identical to what Vicky Ward quotes. And also Acosta, you're right, he denied it explicitly and under oath, under penalty of perjury, and on the record in a 2020 interview by Department of Justice investigators with the Office of Professional Responsibility, who were examining, or maybe it was 2019, that the report came out in 2020, who were examining the 2006, 2008 prosecution, the non-prosecution agreement, et cetera, because there was such an uproar around it at the time after this Miami Herald article in November 2018, or series of articles. And Alex Acosta explicitly denies this. He's asked, did you have any knowledge that Epstein was an intelligence asset? He says no. And absolutely not. It had nothing to do with the non-prosecution agreement, which, like, if you do enough research on the non-prosecution agreement and its origins and like the stuff that went into brokering that, like, it just makes no sense that there would have been any like intelligence aspect. Like, it's just farcical. Acosta testified again in September of 2025 before the House Oversight Committee. You can go get the transcript if you want, where, of course, he's naturally asked about this, and he again denies it explicitly under oath, again, under penalty of perjury. I've heard more things myself that unfortunately I can't report, that definitely bolster the idea that that quote was just bogus, essentially. Another, just Steve Bannon basically just spouting off, and then the keyword
that's not hard. That shouldn't be hard for people to believe.
But nobody ever looks into like the veracity of that quote. Like, it spawned such a huge like little Epstein intelligence asset cottage industry. But one thing I always want to ask, let's just leave aside that quote. Like, because people could say, okay, maybe that quote's phony, but we have all this other evidence. Sometimes I want to ask, okay, let's say he does have someone tied to intelligence, whatever that means exactly. Okay, what is that supposed to signify? Like, what conclusion are we supposed to draw from that information? Because it seems like what would make that information notable is that it would show, people think, that the pedophilic sex trafficking and blackmail operation was done at the behest of an intelligence agency, right? Or like the intelligence agency somehow cooked up this whole op for him to ensnare all these people in his honeypot, Mossad honeypot, or whatever. But like, people never really even know what they're alleging or intimating. It does remind me of Russiagate, because like sometimes there would be this little snippet of information that would come out that would seem to connect Donald Trump or one of his associates or somebody to something to do with Russia. And they would say, hey, look at this, address this. And I would ask them, okay, you're telling me this piece of information unto itself somehow substantiates the idea that Donald Trump was in a collusive conspiracy with Vladimir Putin to subvert the 2026 election and get installed into office? I mean, it was always a logical leap that people just wanted to make, but really the information before them would not rationally permit them to make, but they do it anyway, of course. Because, I mean, there is a lot of, I mean, I never begrudge people for being intrigued by this stuff. I'm massively obsessed with it, as you could probably tell, because he did have this amazing cross-section of contacts and associations. I mean, for God's sake, Michael Jackson, there was a photo of Michael Jackson in the December 19th DOJ production. I found a random message pad from his house in Palm Beach a few days ago of people like calling his house to leave him messages from Holly Berry. I had no idea Holly Berry ever called Jeffrey Epstein. And on and on and on. So, yes, he did have these associations with Israel, such as his relationship with the former prime minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, which actually, by the way, recently, a few days ago, Netanyahu came out and again tried to use that against Ehud Barak and his domestic political opponents in Israel.
Yep, I saw that.
And so, just with the Ehud Barak relationship alone, like, okay, the former prime minister of Israel would have, when he was prime minister, overseen the Mossad. So if Jeffrey Epstein knows the guy, then it's theoretically possible that like some information could be gleaned from Epstein that is then given to Barak, or Barak picks up on, and then something is passed to somebody who's associated with some Israeli state security agency. I mean, that stands to reason, but is that is that like Epstein being tied to intelligence? I don't know. I don't know how even people are conceptualizing that whole notion.
What about Ghislaine Maxwell's father? That's one thing that gets thrown around.
Yeah, that always gets trotted out. Okay, so number one, I don't know about you and your father, but like, I would find it strange if everything my father ever did over the course of his life was somehow assumed to mean that I must have been doing the same thing. My father, as it happens, was never alleged to be tied to Israeli intelligence, but there you have it. It's just like sort of the initial fallacy here and how people reason through this claim. But yes, Robert Maxwell definitely was a big benefactor, a pro-Israel benefactor, who was sort of a media, sort of like a media baron. He had other holdings in the United Kingdom, so he was a wealthy person. He funded sort of like certain pro-Israel philanthropic efforts and and Jewish sort of advocacy efforts. And yeah, people want to then extrapolate from that, I guess. And also, like in the 1940s, he did basically traffic arms to Israel from Czechoslovakia for use in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. Okay, so what? So, like, what does that mean in terms of Ghislaine? So people then want to leap from that to, therefore, Jeffrey Epstein, who had Ghislaine Maxwell as his sort of house manager, one-time romantic relationship, then it became more platonic, and she basically ran his properties, and she worked out of his personal office and drew a salary from him. We're supposed to mean because Robert Maxwell funneled some arms to like the British Mandate of Palestine in 1948, that therefore Jeffrey Epstein was running a Mossad honeypot operation in 2005. I mean, I don't even know. None of this ever adds up. It's just these like this weird, hazily inferential reasoning that people are consigned to do because the actual facts don't align with what they want to ultimately infer.
So what about his message to Deepak Chopra that he said, anywhere but Israel, I hate Israel, something like that? I mean, is that like, should we not even try to interpret that because it could be a joke? Or
it could be a joke. A problem with a lot of these emails is that Epstein was kind of a chronically sarcastic guy, including in his tediously garbled emails and text messages. So a lot of this stuff is tongue-in-cheek, okay?
Yeah.
Maybe not all of it, but like that doesn't always come across if it's just one snippet of a decontextualized email. I don't really know what to make of the Deepak Chopra thing. Not all that much. Look, he did have some engagement with Israel, I guess you could say. There has been reporting, because Ehud Barak's emails were hacked by a pro-Palestinian hacker group, I guess. And yeah, I mean, there were business dealings that Ehud Barak and Epstein jointly pursued that had some connection to Israeli, sort of defense contracting or weapons contracting. And so, yeah, I mean, somebody who's involved in that is going to have a quote tie. I just don't know, again, what we're supposed to ultimately infer from all that. The inference is like almost like left unstated, right? It just means that like, okay, if he's definitely if he was definitely running a sprawling pedophilic sex trafficking operation that was enforced by Blackmail, then if we now find some new little tidbit of information that showed he had a business dealing that dealt with some military connected firm or whatever in Israel, then that only bolsters our pre-existing belief about the pedophilic sex trafficking operation. I don't know. If the logic never really adds up. He
Right.
also clearly, it's come out, like he had communications and dealings with people that connected to the Russian state, obviously the American government. He like knew both Donald Trump and Bill Clinton. Okay, so like those are pretty good connections. The British government, perhaps even the French government, the government of Saudi Arabia. So I don't know. It's just like this whole constellation of connections can't really be distilled into a single little moniker that people can apply, and then it somehow vindicates all their most outlandish fantasies about Epstein. But people don't feel like there has to be any sort of organized process for filtering this information. It's just a scatter plot, almost like that classic Always Sunny in Philadelphia meme where you connect the dots and with the string to all the little bullet points or notes or whatever. That's essentially what this all is. Unless somebody can finally rationally explain to me what they take it all to add up to.
So let me try this one on you. How do we explain the multiple passports, including with fake names?
So there's only one fake name passport.
One fake name passport, right? What is it, Hungarian or what is it? It's some European country, right?
It's an Austrian passport.
Austrian, yeah.
That he evidently got in the 1980s. And I think was seldom if ever used. Would have to refresh my memory. Like if you notice, when I can't say something with enough certainty, I don't just make wild fact claims, which to me seems to typify how people in the quote Epstein space handle this issue, where they'll just like spout off about whatever and like make it seem like they know things they couldn't possibly know or never even researched or just wrong. Not that I can never make an error, but I would correct the error. That never happens in the Epstein, conspiracy brain space. But no, the passports in his possession were seized when the FBI raided his house in July of 2019 after he was federally indicted. So they got his current passport, expired passports, expired American passports that were his, and then there was one Austrian passport that was in a fake name that apparently he was told he should get, or somebody gave to him in the 1980s because when he would travel to the Middle East, this was the claim anyway, you'd want to have a passport on hand that would suggest you weren't Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the claim. But, I think he never actually used it, or that was what his lawyer said when this was discussed in the pretrial motions after he was arrested. But I would have to go back and verify that. But like, okay, so yeah, he had a false passport. People just point to that again and then assume that there's something to be extrapolated from it that they don't quite articulate.
Well, the implication is that you could only get that if you were an intelligence asset, that a normal rich guy couldn't get that.
Okay, I mean, then show me why that would have to be the case. Or like he clearly wasn't a normal rich guy. Like I don't go around and saying, hey, and people always accuse me of saying, or people always say to me, why are you telling us there's nothing to see here, blah, 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 blah. No, there's a lot to see here. First of all, how a moral panic and mass hysteria functions in contemporary America. So a lot to see here. Mm-hmm. But also just in terms of the saga of Jeffrey Epstein himself, I mean, yeah, it's endlessly interesting. He was not a normal rich guy. He had this astounding multitude of connections with high-level people. He did have association with Bill Gates, Steve Bannon, Noam Chomsky, you name it. Tom Barak is like another one I just saw, who's the current, I believe, U.S. ambassador to either Jordan or Syria, Lebanon, I think. Donald Trump, I mean, the current freaking president. So Bill, Clinton, it's just on and on and on. So I don't think he was a normal rich guy. He was like a preternaturally skillful networker, mover and shaker, you might say, money manager. So he wasn't a normal rich guy. So I wouldn't be surprised if he had some unique connection somewhere along the line that allowed him to procure this passport.
Right. Okay. So
like when you're like a multiple hundred millionaire, like when he was arrested and his lawyers had to declare what his assets were, it was put like at like 650 or 700 million. So he wasn't a billionaire according to that, but like when you have that range of money, like, yeah, opportunities open up for you to get stuff, to meet people, to have very exclusive social soirees, to do all sorts of things. And if people looked at this issue through the frame of, oh, it's almost like a lifestyles of the rich and famous, like, and maybe, yeah, there are some unseemly aspects to it, and we can almost do it as like a case study of like elite society, that I would be more interested in, or that I would be also interested in, that I could sort of almost co-sign. But that's not what people are looking through this. That's not the prism people are looking at this through.
So you talked earlier about how the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell was, I don't know what word you exactly described.
Shambolic, I think.
Shambolic. So why was it shambolic? And, doesn't the fact that she was convicted give some credence to the overall perception people have of Epstein and his criminality?
Not in my view. Sure, on paper, it is true that she was convicted and she's sitting in federal prison right now. But having done an embarrassingly in-depth investigation of that trial, reviewed virtually all of the trial exhibits, the subsequent appeals, she just submitted a new habeas petition in December, basically claiming that the trial was flawed and therefore she should be, the conviction should be vacated. So I've looked into quite a bit of it, and it's just stunning to me how shambolic the trial was. And it's stunning that she was actually convicted at all. I think it's a function of the climate at the time, meaning somebody had to pay for Jeffrey Epstein's sins. This was the perception. It was sort of right around a peak of Me Too, maybe a little bit after the peak, but like 2021, you're still basically in an era where we're all supposed to be having this reckoning around how the structural wrongs against women victims or female victims need to be rectified. And there must be this like gigantic correction. And also just specific details having to do with that case. So for one thing, it was basically contaminated by the emergence of this financial incentive. So the trial begins in November of 2021. Maybe it was October. I believe it was November 2021. And at that point, you already have these settlement funds flowing from the Epstein estate. So just to give you one example, one of the witnesses that was called, there were only 4 alleged victims of hers that were called to testify against her. One of them was Nadia Bjorlin, happened to be an actor on the soap opera Days of Our Lives, and that was information withheld from the jury. I'm not saying that she couldn't have been sexually abused because she's a soap opera actress, but I don't know. I would maybe like to know that if I'm a juror and I have to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt and send them to prison for 20 years. Nadia Bjorlin had already like several civil suits going, first against the Epstein estate in an individualized suit where she was demanding like $40 or $20 million. $40 million. She sued Maxwell individually for something like $20 million, I believe. And she hired personal injury lawyers in Los Angeles saying, look, who sent the letter? Actually, this just came out. I just saw this recently. So thank God for the Epstein files. I knew this existed, but I hadn't seen it yet. Where her lawyers are saying, her lawyers are telling the Epstein Victims Compensation Program, the fund drawn from the estate, that Nadia Bjorlin should be entitled to the maximum possible payout because she was collaborating with federal prosecutors to prosecute Maxwell. So talk about an incentive, right? A perverse incentive. And so she goes to testify, right? She, one of the overt acts that she alleges happened, because like to establish a conspiracy charge, you need subordinate overt acts. It's sort of complicated, but one of the overt acts that stemmed from her that she stated at trial was that over the course of her interactions with Epstein and or Maxwell, there came a time where there was an orgy in which Maxwell herself was a participant, and so too was Nadia Bjorlin a participant. So you would think, okay, if we're at trial, who were the other participants in this orgy? And the government never produced them, but the defense produced them. The women came to testify, and they said no such orgy ever took place. Maxwell, of course, always denied it. And so that's 1 of 4. Now think of this. 4 total alleged victims testify at trial, called by the government. The government has been saying for months, since July of 2005, that there are over 1,000 total victims of Jeffrey Epstein. So of that alleged universe of victims, they found 4 to testify against Maxwell. They contemplated calling Virginia Roberts Giuffre, but don't call her. They call 4. One was the Nadia Burlow, I just mentioned. Another one was Anushka.
Now, hold on. And this alleged orgy, was that the crime she was alleging happened during that alleged orgy?
Or it was one of the overt acts to establish like a sex trafficking conspiracy charge.
I see. Okay.
One of them was Anushka DeGorgiou, who was a British underwear model. I'm not saying people that an underwear model can never be sexually abused. I'm just pointing it out. Who continued to remain in contact with Jeffrey Epstein into her 30s and propositioned him for a sexy time visit, offered to come visit him in jail in Florida in 2008-9, and into the 2010s was saying, hey, are you there? Are you in New York? I'd love to come visit you, when she's like in her early to mid 30s. And by the way, she was ruled by the presiding judge, federal Allison Nathan, in an instruction to the jury that she had not been subjected to any, quote, illegal sexual activity for the purposes of convicting Maxwell. And yet, when she's ever in the media these days, she's just presumptively yet another, quote, survivor. That same ruling of no illegal sexual activity was also ruled of Annie Farmer, another one of the 4, the sister of the nut job Maria, who's slightly more presentable, slightly less like overtly insane, although probably more shrewd and sinister in her own way. I tried to interview her in Washington, D.C. in November and also September, and she threw this whole fit and this whole scene where, as though I was like abusing her. I mean, it's incredible. They don't take any actual critical questions about anything, and they're all like multimillionaires. Annie Farmer got 1.5 million. Or was it 2.5? I think 1.5 million from only just one of the funds. Tax-free, by the way. There's a quirk in the IRS code that they inserted into the settlement provisions so that they don't have to pay income tax on the money. She got 1.5 million from the Epstein Victims Compensation Program from the estate because she said she was sexually abused by handholding. Seriously. But the government called her because they're supposed to make this whole theory around grooming. Even if there's no overt sexual, like wrongful sexual contact. So that's another one. So Nadia Bjorlin, Anushka DeGorgiou, Annie Farmer. Number 4 was Carolyn Andriano, who is sort of a rehash of some of the Florida charges from the early to mid 2000s, who got on the stand at trial and said that she was actively schizophrenic. She was hearing voices in her head telling her that her children were going to be abducted by sex traffickers. Now, of course, theoretically, somebody who's schizophrenic can still have been sexually abused. But in terms of convicting somebody beyond a reasonable doubt and hinging the evidence on the testimony of someone who's actively schizophrenic about events 20 years before the fact. This is 2021. She's talking about stuff from like 01, 02. It's a little bit questionable. And she was also like a long-term drug addict, drug user. I'm just talking about impairment of memory. I'm not casting moral aspersion. And what she alleged that was even supposed to tie Maxwell into some kind of trafficking scheme was always just very nebulous. Ironically enough, you know who she did unambiguously accuse of trafficking her? To the extent that we buy into the whole premise of trafficking, which I really don't at this point because it's such a infinitely elastic concept and it's just like subject to the whims of prosecutor's discretion. You know who she did accuse of trafficking her? Unambiguously? Take a guess.
I don't know.
Virginia Roberts Giuffre.
Weird.
That's right.
Okay.
So, I don't know. And I could get into a lot more in terms of the flaws of that trial. There was a juror who was admitted to be on the jury who lied on the jury questionnaire And the question he lied on was, have you yourself ever been sexually abused as a child? Were you sexually abused as a child? Because the idea was that if somebody had been sexually abused as a child, it could taint their impartiality.
Mhm.
The guy lied on the form. He gets admitted to the jury pool. The jurors in the jury pool have doubts as to the credibility of the witnesses and the evidence. So they're thinking, I don't know the full details, but according to how this guy tells it, they might have been getting ready to either acquit her or a mistrial or what have you. The guy stands up in this dramatic oration and says, I have something to share with you all. I too am a survivor of child sexual abuse. I believe these women, and I need you to believe them too. Something to that effect. We know this because after the trial, the guy went around on a media tour and recounted all this. So not only should he not have been on the jury at all, he used the very experiences that they were supposed to be filtering for to persuade the jury to overlook their misgivings and convict Maxwell. And yet another juror anonymously confirmed to the New York Times that they too, he or she, was somebody who says that they were sexually abused as a child. And really? And there might have even been one more. So you would think that would be a ripe for an appeal, but the appeals were all denied. And there were plenty of other issues that were more than appealable. So I could say a lot more, but we've gone on for pretty long.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks,
But
Michael.
in general, no, I don't accept this idea that because she was convicted, that therefore vindicates any other aspect of all this. It was a shambolic trial. You know, people might get upset, but I'm of the view that she was wrongly convicted and is wrongly imprisoned. I don't know what to tell you.
Okay, the final element I want to talk about, and it's, I think just the majority of Americans believe it at this point, is that Jeffrey Epstein did not commit suicide. And you can get, many people have actually done pretty good treatments of the evidence we have. I think Rich Lowry at National Review did one that I thought was really good. And
I didn't know that. I didn't know that Rich Lowry is now, even Rich Lowry is now writing about the Epstein death. That's funny.
Yeah. And like, obviously the first thing, before getting into any details about it, and you can just tell me what you think of it, but just the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell is still alive, like if Epstein was killed because of what he knew, then presumably Ghislaine Maxwell knows all that stuff too, and has been alive, for 6 years. So right off the bat, it's illogical to assume he was killed for what he knew or killed for the compromise he had on various powerful people. But then you can also get into the actual details of the mismanagement and the coincidences and the cameras that went out and all that, and kind of go through them one by one and see actually, are they explained by conspiracy or by run-of-the-mill prison mismanagement?
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think it can be presumed true that everything Jeffrey Epstein knew, Ghislaine Maxwell must also therefore have known. Because people have exaggerated their interchangeability, especially the government, when she was basically the scapegoat for them to go after in the wake of Jeffrey Epstein's death, because there was such a clamor to find somebody to prosecute in lieu of him. So they kind of crafted a whole narrative about how she was so joined at the hip with him. I mean, she was a close, definitely associate with him, but the idea that, he would frequently do stuff without her there, or have relationships and interactions and all kinds of endeavors that were separate and apart from her. So I don't know that it could just be assumed that they must have had all the same information. But on the death itself, and also, but at the same time, though, I mean, essentially, you're pretty much right that, like, if she does have the scope of information that people ascribe to her, then presumably she would also have to be offed. And she just she just pleaded the fifth yesterday before the House Oversight Committee in a video deposition. So there you have it. In terms of the death itself, this is an area where, believe it or not, and this is going to be counterintuitive to everything else I've said thus far in this podcast discussion, as more information has come out, I become more amenable to at least a tentative willingness to accept the idea that his cause of death was actually homicide rather than suicide. I'm not going to say with certainty I know one way or another, but I'm also not going to say I know with certainty that it was suicide. And I'm not going to say I know with certainty that it was homicide. How I put it is that my confidence interval on this plank of, let's say, the Epstein mythology or the Epstein theory is much lower as to the falsity of it, the falsity of something resembling a more maximalist version of it. So why do I say that? There are a bunch of reasons. Number one, I've spoken at length with Mark Epstein, Epstein's brother, who was his next of kin after he died, because Epstein had no spouse or children. So it fell to Mark Epstein to handle his affairs. And Mark Epstein hired an independent pathologist to examine Epstein's body for an autopsy. That pathologist found that the injuries Epstein sustained were more consistent with homicide than suicide. The city
wasn't that independent pathologist Michael? What's his name?
Michael Baden. Yeah,
the same one that thought OJ was innocent.
Michael Baden was hired by the defense counsel to do independent pathological reports on the OJ Simpson case,
and he argued that OJ couldn't have done the murder.
Let's not get to a whole OJ rabbit hole.
But I know, but I consider him his credibility very low as a pathologist.
I don't think that's fair, actually. I mean, so do you know any other bodies he's examined, or just OJ? Or do you know any other cases he was involved in?
He was hired on the George Floyd case as well.
Okay.
And his press conference there was dubious in many ways. I could get into.
So let's not get diverted on that. I'm just sketching out why I think there's reasonable doubt to be had as to the matter of Epstein's death. Okay.
Sure.
And Mark Epstein himself, is convinced that it was a homicide. And I do not think that Mark Epstein is otherwise like an erratic or irrational person. He always seems pretty grounded to me, because he's been unable to obtain documents from New York City, the New York City health authority or health department related to his brother's death, even though he's the next of kin. And there's a bunch of other oddities. There are a lot of oddities, and so this might be seen as hypocritical on my part. I'm pointing to oddities and then not making a firm conclusion or not surmising something that's coherent from them. Well, the coherent surmise I'm offering now is that there's reasonable doubt as to the matter of the death. Okay. 2.5 weeks prior to Epstein's ultimate death, there was an incident in which he was injured in the prison. And he told the prison psychologist that he was attacked by his cellmate and that he would never commit suicide. Some of this has come out. There have been some more documentation about this that's come out recently, but this came out really. The first thing that I saw that comprehensively went all through this was the 2023 Department of Justice Inspector General report on the Bureau of Prisons. If people are curious, go read it. So he tells the prison psychologist that he would never kill himself. There's been other material that has said that he told the prison basically officials that it was forbidden in the Jewish religion and he was a Jew. I think that might have been a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek remark on his part, just like so many other remarks that he made over the years. I'm not sure how observant a practitioner of Judaism he was, but he was, Jewish. And the cellmate at the time was this guy, Nicholas Tartaglione, who was kind of like a brutish former cop who was getting ready to stand trial for multiple murders and was convicted. And so Epstein reports that he's been attacked, right, by the cellmate, and then he changes the story and claims that actually he can't remember what happened. So it's very ambiguous. Because remember,
is it true that he then asked to be with that cellmate again later?
That he asked to be with the same cellmate later?
Yeah, I read that somewhere.
It's possible. I can't quite remember.
Okay.
Just remember, in prison, what's the culture? No snitching. You can't collaborate with the. They call them the police. Anybody who's like a government worker in prison is the police, unless you can turn them, right, and then they're working almost for you, which also happens obviously in prison, the American prison system anyway. But you definitely can't rat anybody out. So that's different from just working with a prison guard. So Epstein basically retracts the statement. In any event, it's ambiguous what went on there.
Yeah.
Then one of the cameras was in fact disabled. That would have given a more direct view of who's going in and out of his cell. There were other cameras that were operational during that time, August 9th, 10th, 2019, where you can get like another angle of like the corridor in this cell block. But it's just a data point that there's no direct camera view of the Epstein cell. And so now, all that being said, let's say, for the sake of argument, hypothetically, it was a homicide. It need not, therefore, be the case that the homicide must have been perpetrated through some elaborate, grandiose espionage plot where some combination of Mossad and Donald Trump and, I don't know, the Clinton Foundation infiltrates the federal jail facility in Manhattan and takes Epstein out because he just knows too much. Okay, that's sort of a caricature of what could possibly be the case. I've always said, I don't know how this never occurred to anyone before, apparently, that if he was perceived at the time, which he was, rightly or wrongly, I would say wrongly, but he was perceived at the time to be the most notorious pedophile in America, maybe in all of American history. Don't you think that might entail some potential security problems for somebody in prison, given how people who are accused of such things tend to be treated?
No conspiracy required.
Well, or there could have been like a very low-level conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, the guard looks the other way, lets the inmate go in and take him out. Yeah. It's something like that.
Right.
Nothing that would necessarily validate all our most deep longings for this climactic espionage drama.
Right.
Now, if I had to guess, like if you put a gun to my head, did he kill himself or was he killed? I would probably still say, he committed suicide. But my level of confidence is much lower than with virtually every other aspect of this entire story.
Yeah.
So that's just me trying to go based on the evidence in terms of like what reasonable conclusions are about what is most reasonable to conclude.
Yeah, I agree with you on that relative ranking. I mean, initially I was definitely given pause by the fact, and it might have been Michael Baden as much criticism as I threw on him that pointed this out, that the markings on his neck look to this layman. Admittedly, I'm not a pathologist. I don't really know what I'm talking here, but anyone can look at this. It looks a lot more like someone pulled something horizontally backwards than someone self-hung from above. And this is one of the, I've never quite heard a satisfying explanation for why that would be the case. But it's the kind of thing where many times in the past, an expert has simply explained to me, this can happen for that reason. And so,
yeah. And also, his legal options were far from exhausted at that point. He was still regularly meeting with his defense attorneys, and they had some potentially decent arguments to use on his behalf. Mm-hmm. For example, he was supposed to have been immunized from any further prosecution by that non-prosecution agreement. That was the whole point in 2008. But under this avalanche of political and media pressure, the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York came up with all these cockamamie arguments for how they could basically circumvent the non-prosecution agreement and structure an indictment against Epstein that they claim was not bound by it. Mm-hmm. And that had yet to be tested, right, in the court proceedings. Mm-hmm. He had a bail hearing scheduled so he was dead on a Saturday, August 10th, and he had a bail hearing scheduled for either Monday or Tuesday, I believe, the following week, where he was being told that there was like a decent chance maybe he would actually be granted bail. Okay. So, yeah, again, there's some other curiosities that I think justify at least being open-minded about the cause of death.
Got it. All right, Michael Tracey, let's leave it there. Thank you so much. I think this will be very useful to people, and keep doing what you're doing, even through all the mud that gets slung on you.
I'm used to it. Thanks a lot.